Hey guys, tonight we're about to trudge through the moonlit corridors of medieval castles, peep into smoky, candlelit cottages, and, if you're lucky, survive a day in the battered shoes of someone desperate to look beautiful. In an era where beauty standards were brutal, impossible, and just a little bit bonkers, imagine you wake up and your first thought is, I hope my skin looks just pale enough to make people whisper. I am either noble or at death's door. Sunlight drifts through a dusty window. You squint, and already you're in trouble. The paler your face, the higher your status. But heaven help you if you get a tan. You're suddenly just another peasant trudging through muck. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're re-listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your eyes flutter closed, the room fades, and you're suddenly somewhere very old, colder, quieter, and haunted by the sense that everyone is staring at your face, especially if it's not almost translucent. There's a reason everyone you see in those medieval portraits looks like they've just received really bad news. They're busy chasing that pale, porcelain perfection, and it is no easy task. You wake at dawn as the church bell clangs in the distance. The medieval version of an alarm clock, only louder and somehow even less merciful. The air is freezing. And unless you're one of the lucky few who can afford to sleep past sunrise, you're already worried about your skin. For nobles and for anyone who hoped to pass as one, the absolute goal was to look as though you'd never worked a day outdoors in your entire life. To have skin untouched by the sun was to proclaim to the world, I have servants for that. A tan, on the other hand, was the unmistakable mark of the peasantry, sign that you spent your days hauling turnips and breathing in dust. This is the great mainstream historical fact of medieval beauty. Paleness equaled privilege. It was a visual currency, a silent language that separated the leisured aristocracy from the laboring masses. But you're not reaching for SPF 50. No, you're far more likely to be mixing up a homemade concoction, because medieval skincare was a dangerous and often deadly blend of hope and questionable chemistry. To lighten your face, you might try a paste made from white lead and vinegar, a popular formula known as Venetian ceruse. You would slather this thick white paint onto your face, creating a smooth, ghostly mask that hid freckles, blemishes, and any sign that you were a living, breathing human with blood in your veins. It was also, as we now know, a recipe for neurological disaster, slowly poisoning you with every application. But hey, fashion before function, right? If the lead paste was a bit too expensive, or if you simply wanted to try a different approach, you could always resort to bleeding yourself. Some medieval beauty enthusiasts would use leeches, or even small knives, to drain blood from their cheeks, all in the desperate pursuit of that ultra-pale, fashionably ill look. It really puts your modern skincare routine into perspective. At least it does and involve a bucket of leeches and a prayer that you do and pass out. This is where a fascinating scholarly debate emerges. For a long time, historians assumed this obsession with paleness was purely about social status. The logic was simple. Nobles stayed indoors, peasants worked outdoors, so pale skin was the ultimate class signifier. It was a straightforward way to advertise that you were far removed from the dirt and toil of physical labor. But more recently, scholars have begun to wonder if there was a deeper, more spiritual dimension to this ideal. The church's influence was, after all, inescapable. Think of the art of the time. In illuminated manuscripts and on church altarpieces, saints and the Virgin Mary are almost always depicted with serene, luminous, and impossibly white skin. This has led some historians to argue that the beauty standard wasn't just about wealth, but also about signaling spiritual purity. A pale, unblemished face was seen as an outward reflection of a pure, untarnished soul. In a world steeped in religious symbolism, looking like a saint was perhaps the highest form of beauty one could aspire to. The paler, the nun, the more the common folk might believe she had attained a certain level of heavenly devotion, her skin untouched by worldly sin or sun. So was it about class, or was it about piety? The debate continues, but it was likely a complex mix of both. A world where social climbing and spiritual aspiration were painted onto the face with the very same brush. And the quest for paleness didn't stop with just a white face. To truly achieve the look of a refined, delicate noble, you had to take it a step further. You had to show off your veins. Yes, visible blue veins, especially on the temples, neck, and hands, were considered incredibly chic. It was the ultimate proof that your skin was so thin, so translucent, utterly free from the coarseness of labor, that one could practically see the noble blue blood flowing beneath. Some women would carefully use a blue pigment to draw faint, spidery lines on their skin, enhancing the illusion of fragility. The more you looked like a delicate porcelain doll on the verge of shattering, the more beautiful you were considered. You didn't want to look alive and robust. You wanted to look like an artfully preserved corpse, a being too ethereal for this world. This was the strange, brutal, and deadly serious game of medieval beauty, where your complexion could be your greatest asset or your most telling failure. You're still there, perched on a creaking stool in your candlelit room, peering into your little mirror, fretting about your paleness. But now, your attention drifts higher, to your hairline. Because in medieval Europe, it's not enough to look like you haven't seen the sun since you were 6. Now you have to look like you haven't had a normal hairline either. The ideal is a forehead so grand and high, it would make even a modern supermodel do a double take. Here's the reality. The more foreheads you show, the better. Nobility, fashion, and even art start dictating that the perfect face is one with a vast, gleaming expanse above the brows. A 5-head, as some might snicker today. So what do? You pluck, and pluck, and if plucking isn't enough, you shave. Or, if you're feeling truly adventurous, you apply caustic concoctions to dissolve those stubborn baby hairs at the edge of your scalp. Forget threading your eyebrows. This is full-on facial landscaping. This fashion wasn't just for women, though. Ladies certainly led the trend. You'd see high-born women in their bedchambers, squinting by the firelight, tweezers in hand, wincing as they tug out hair after hair. Some even enlisted their maids for the task, turning hair plucking into a somber after-dinner ritual. If you want to be beautiful, you must endure. It's a truth that echoes through the ages, but back then, the pain was more of a guarantee than a risk. The mainstream historical fact is that paintings from the 15th century, like those of the regal Woodville family, or even the famed Mona Lisa, show women with impossibly high foreheads. Sometimes they are so smooth and broad you wonder if the artist just got bored of drawing hair. But this was a real trend. Artists didn't just invent this. They were reflecting the exacting standards of their era. And here is the quirky tidbit. The medieval recipe books didn't stop at simple plucking or shaving. Some recommended using a mixture of walnut oil and vinegar as a sort of ancient depilatory, intended to discourage hair from growing back. Others suggested rubbing the skin with burnt barley, or more alarmingly, cat dung. Imagine waking up each day and having to decide whether you'd rather have a bit of stubble or smell faintly of the barnyard. It gives a whole new meaning to a beauty routine with character. And just when you think you've finished, the fashion moves on you. If your eyebrows are too close to your newly expanded hairline, you'll need to start thinning them too, sometimes plucking them into faint. Surprised arches, or removing them altogether. The only thing more dangerous than failing to achieve this look was succeeding, since infection, irritation, and permanent scars were all too common side effects. Medieval beauty products, as you're beginning to learn, were not exactly FDA approved. This is where another historical debate takes shape. Historians still argue whether this high forehead obsession was a trend that came from the influence of specific, powerful royal courts, perhaps in France or Burgundy, where new fashions tended to spread like wildfire, whether it was a more organic, broader cultural shift designed to distinguish the civilized from the rustic. After all, if you have the time, money, and sheer pain tolerance to devote to endless facial grooming, you're probably not spending your days churning butter or mucking out a stall. It was a beauty standard that required leisure, a luxury most people simply didn't have. But did the trend ever trickle down to the countryside? Some folk stories and parish records suggest that village girls might have tried to emulate the look for feast days, perhaps using sharpened sticks or even clamshells as makeshift tweezers. However, other tales suggest that peasants just laughed at the rich behind closed doors. with some village storytellers mocking the highbrow city ladies, claiming only those with something to hide would scrape away so much of their own God-given hair. One can just imagine the village gossip. Look at that fellow from the city, someone might whisper at the market. His hair starts halfway down his face. Unthinkable. Still, the pressure remained at court. The higher your forehead, the more people believed you were wise, noble, and let's be honest, a little bit intimidating. You wander the castle halls and you notice the other women, all with their hair pulled back tightly under elaborate hoods or veils, their foreheads gleaming and bare. Some look proud, some look pained, and some just look tired. You realize that, just as with skin tone, these standards create a kind of secret code. One glance, and you know who belongs and who doesn't. There's a joke that if you lived back then and your family had a particularly low hairline, you'd probably be the talk of the village, and not in a good way. And for a final odd detail, some medieval beauty experts recommended wearing a tight cap or a band of cloth across the hairline overnight, supposedly to train the hair to stay back. The most likely result? You'd wake up with a temporary crease across your forehead, and, if you were unlucky, even less hair than you started with. Fashion, meet futility. You drift to sleep, your forehead tingling with phantom plucking pains, thankful that at least you're safe from vinegar-scented scalp cream. You're lying there half awake in your drafty chamber, still nursing the phantom sting from your most recent forehead plucking. And suddenly, you remember. The real badge of medieval beauty is cascading, impossibly long, glossy hair. Not the kind of hair that just grows, no. This is hair that is meant to ripple like a silk banner in a summer breeze, framing that freshly expanded brow in waves that seem to shimmer in the candlelight. For women, especially, hair is everything. The longer, thicker, and glossier, the better. Men had their own hair anxieties, of course, but for a woman, her hair was almost a currency. A public declaration of her health, her youth, and most importantly, her fertility. The ideal hair is so long it can be coiled into elaborate braids, tucked under a heavy headdress, or, on very rare and special occasions, left loose and artfully displayed. If you are a young, unmarried woman, your hair is your finest asset. Something you guard, cherish, and perhaps subtly weaponize in the silent social battles of the court. If you are a married woman, your hair goes under wraps, quite literally, hidden beneath veils and wimples, its beauty reserved for your husband's eyes alone. Unfortunately, your body, and the medieval world in general, has other plans for your glorious mane, but with the stress of daily life, a diet that was often shockingly poor in nutrients, and, let's face it, some very questionable hygiene habits, achieving that perfect, flowing cascade was a near impossible task. This is the great mainstream historical fact of medieval hair care. Women prized long, healthy hair, and there is an abundance of evidence in art and literature to prove it. Poems from the era endlessly praise golden tresses, and folk tales are filled with heroines, whose hair could be knotted into ropes or spun into thread. Some noble women, it was said, never cut their hair at all, except perhaps for a ritual trim in childhood. The only times a woman's hair might be shorn would be as a sign of deep penance or punishment, or in the case of a dire health emergency. Otherwise, it was to be tended like a precious garden. If your garden was constantly subject to lice, split ends, and more than a few disastrous homemade tonics, you probably don't have access to modern shampoo or conditioner. If you're fortunate, your household might possess sweet-smelling herbs, rosemary, lavender, or rose petals, which could be boiled and strained to create a fragrant rinse for your hair. If not, you're likely stuck with a very basic and very harsh lye-based soap, a substance more likely to turn your precious hair into straw than silk. A good hair day in medieval Europe is a rare and celebrated event, and you can be certain that people take notice. To be told your hair looks almost clean today is to be given a genuine and much appreciated compliment. But here's where we find a wonderfully quirky tidbit. Hair pieces and fake plaits were not just for the ultra-rich or the theatrically inclined. Plenty of women resorted to padded rolls, braids, and hair extensions made from goat or horse hair, even from discarded human hair gathered by enterprising maids from combs and brushes. So, if you've ever worried about your modern extensions showing at a party, Just imagine your medieval rival glancing over and noticing that your brand new, elaborate braid smells faintly equestrian. Some women even went as far as to dye their hair with risky, homemade brews. Saffron for a hint of gold, walnut husks for a deep chestnut brown, or a harsh lye mixture to strip the color entirely. The results were always unpredictable, but the effort was always monumental. You sit by the fire, trying to coax your own hair into a passable braid, wincing as the comb snags on another knot. And if your hair isn't long enough to create the towering, fashionable styles of the day, well, you can always fake it. There are stories of women who would save their own shed hair all year, twisting it into what were known as rats, hair. Cushions not the rodent, although with medieval cleanliness, who can say for sure to pad out their buns and rolls? The more elaborate your hairstyle, the more status you broadcast. Historians still argue about whether these intricate hair rituals were strictly enforced across all levels of society, or if they were mostly reserved for the highborn ladies of the court. Did a village girl with simply bobbed hair feel left out of the latest trends, or did she and her friends just laugh at the silly, impractical fashions of the nobility? Some medieval manuscripts and folk stories suggest that even farm girls took immense pride in their hair, using simple oils when they could get them and borrowing styles they saw at church festivals. But the stakes for noble women were undoubtedly higher. Imagine being judged not just for your dowry and your virtues, but for how glossy your hair looked in the firelight. Marriage negotiations could, and sometimes did, hinge on it. Suitors might inquire about the length and thickness of your hair before they asked about your family's fortune. There is even a record of one 15th-century Italian countess who refused to attend a feast because a sudden mishap with a candle had left her with a lopsided braid and embarrassment she simply could not bear to face in public. And then there's the ever-present problem of hygiene. With all this hair comes trouble. Medieval combs, usually made from bone or wood, were precious objects, sometimes beautifully carved and passed down through generations. Lice were incredibly common, so daily, meticulous combing became both a necessity and a ritual. If your hair ever became truly infested, the only real solution might be to shave your head entirely and start over. A humiliation you would cover up as best you could with a wimple, hood, or a veil. The phrase bad hair day takes on a whole new meaning. When it lasts for weeks and involves a public health crisis on your scalp, in the end, what you do with your hair says everything about you. The styles are endless. Tight buns, elaborate plaits wound with colorful ribbons or beads, flowing curls for the lucky few who had them naturally, head-on for the very fashionable, hair netted in delicate cages of gold or silver thread. If you could afford it, you hired a servant whose entire job was to care for your hair. If not, well, you made do. Sometimes making do involved a bit of mud and spit to hold a particularly rebellious style in place. That's right, your hair gel was occasionally a handful of earth mixed with a prayer. You're waking again, or at least shifting in your bed of straw and wool. And now you realize your face and hair aren't the only things up for scrutiny. In the candlelit world of the Middle Ages, your entire silhouette is judged, especially your waistline. You might assume that corsets are an invention of later, more famously restrictive centuries. But the truth is, medieval folk already had plenty of tricks for squeezing themselves into the ideal shape. And it was rarely, if ever, comfortable. The era's poetry and art praised slender waists, gently swelling hips, and a delicate, almost frail figure for women. Never mind that most peasants have bodies built by years of hard work and coarse bread. The nobility were expected to look soft, willowy, and somehow ethereal. Not strong, not muscular, not robust, just fragile enough to make anyone worry you might blow away in a stiff breeze. The mainstream historical fact is that by the 13th and 14th centuries, fitted gowns became the height of fashion for upper-class women. These gowns were tailored closely to the torso, laced tightly at the sides or back, and constructed specifically to show off a narrow waist. The cotehardie, a type of fitted dress that hugged the upper body before flaring out into a full skirt, became especially popular. If you are a noblewoman, your maid might spend a good half an hour each morning yanking on your laces, fussing over the smoothness of your bodice, and reminding you to suck in your stomach. You breathe in. No, tighter, she might insist, her hands working the cords until you feel your ribs begin to complain. The goal isn't comfort, it's appearance. And don't worry too much about eating a hearty meal at the midday feast. There's simply no room for it now. Many a lady of the court was known to skip breakfast and lunch, all just to maintain the elegant illusion of a waist no wider than a whisper. If you happen to faint during the long Sunday Mass, people might murmur about your delicate constitution, but more likely it's just the lack of food and the lack of space to breathe. But here sat the quirky tidbit that adds another layer of artifice to this pursuit of the perfect shape. Before the age of whalebone and steel-boned corsets, people stuffed their garments with reeds, tow, flax fibers, or even bundles of moss to help shape their figure. Some women wore padded rolls, affectionately known as bum rolls, around their hips to exaggerate the difference between their waist and hips, creating that coveted hourglass look that was so difficult to achieve naturally. If it squished, poked, or made you walk with a strange swaying gait, it was probably in fashion at some point. You tug at the laces of your dress, feeling the padded roll shift uncomfortably at your back. And wonder if anyone can tell that half of your fashionable silhouette is just cleverly placed stuffing. Historians still argue about whether these extreme silhouettes were really the norm for all women, or whether the trend was reserved for a few ultra-fashionable courts in places like France, Burgundy, or Italy. Some surviving records and artwork show that working women, by necessity, wore their gowns looser, allowing for the freedom of movement required for their daily tasks. But one thing is certain: as soon as you set foot near the nobility, the pressure is on.
Ow.
You know those images in illuminated manuscripts of graceful ladies with impossibly slender torsos? That wasn't always just artistic license. Some women did everything humanly possible to appear slim, layering their clothes, lacing themselves in, and even slouching in a particular way to trick the eye into seeing a smaller waist. There are even tales of young girls being trained from an early age to stand and move with grace, sometimes with books balanced on their heads and heavy, wooden boards tied to their backs to teach them straight posture and the proper way to carry themselves in these restrictive garments. Let's pause for a little joke. Ever try to run in a tightly laced dress? Don't. Not unless you want to trip over your own feet, rip a very expensive seam, and end up as the main topic of gossip at the castle for a week. Did you hear about Lady Marjorie? She fell again. Should have loosened her laces. No, but the obsession didn't just stop at the waist. At various times, flat stomachs, small busts, and narrow shoulders were also in vogue. Some women resorted to wearing tight undergarments, simple linen bands that were wound tightly around the chest, squeezing everything down and in. The desired look was youthful and pure, though the comfort level was somewhere between sleeping on a bed of rocks and getting a hug from a particularly enthusiastic tree trunk. There was also the ever-popular belt, often slung low on the hips and studded with gems or intricate metalwork. A belt wasn't just an accessory to hold things up. It was a status symbol of the highest order. The fancier the belt, the more people assumed you were important. Sometimes these belts were gifts from husbands to their wives, serving as a not-so-subtle reminder to stay trim. Talk about a fashion statement with pressure. By evening, as you finally get help to unlace your gown, you would sigh with relief, rubbing the red marks the cords have left on your ribs, and promising yourself that tomorrow you'll loosen it up just a little bit. But then you remember, tomorrow is the May Day festival, and everyone will be watching. You'll wake up early, struggle back into your dress, and try not to faint during Mass. Beauty may be pain, but in the Middle Ages, it was also a full-time job, one with very little room for error or for snacks. You roll to your side, half cocooned in scratchy linen, and feel the pinch of your shoes. Yes, those shoes. Because tonight, you're not just a head of hair, a pale face, or a corseted waist, but a pair of dainty feet squished and shuffled into a pointy-toed nightmare. The medieval beauty ideal for feet is, let's say, uniquely punishing. The smaller and more delicate your feet appear, the better. But the longer and more pointed your shoes, the more status you command. Forget comfort. If your toes aren't tingling with a dull, persistent pain, you're simply not doing it right. Let's imagine stepping out of bed, already bracing yourself for the squeeze. If you're a noble, your shoes aren't practical boots or sturdy sandals. No, your most prized possession is a pair of poulaines, shoes with tips so long and narrow that walking becomes a calculated risk. This is our mainstream historical fact for this part of our journey. In the 14th and 15th centuries, absurdly long, pointed shoes were all the rage in the courts of Europe, from Paris to Prague. Known as poulaines or krakos, these shoes had toes that could extend 6, 8, or even 12 inches past the actual foot. Sometimes, the points were supported with little whalebone wire, or moss stays so they wouldn't drag sadly behind you like a defeated serpent. The longer the toe, the higher your status, until, inevitably, the king or the church would declare a moral panic and try to ban them for being too outrageous, too prideful, and frankly, a public tripping hazard. Lawmakers and priests alike decried them as symbols of vanity and a danger to morals. Some towns even passed specific laws restricting how long the points could be, especially for commoners. If you were caught with poulaines that extended beyond the legally permitted length for your social class, you might be heavily fined or, even more humiliatingly, have your shoe tips cut down in public. Picture the scene. A burly town constable, armed with a pair of shears, snipping your fancy leather tips while the entire market crowd giggles into their hands. But how did anyone actually wear these things? Here we find our quirky tidbit. People got incredibly creative to cheat the agonizing physics of the poulaine. To keep their feet from sliding forward and crumpling painfully into the long, empty toe box, some would stuff the tips of their shoes with soft materials like wool, moss, or even sand. It was a bit of hidden padding to maintain the shoe as dramatic shape, without sacrificing every bone in your foot. There are even tales of court jesters, those medieval agents of chaos, secretly filling a rival courtier's shoes with pebbles as a prank. Nothing quite like watching Lady Marjorie hobble across the Great Hall with a forced, pained smile, all in the name of high fashion. And it wasn't just the shape of your shoes that mattered, but the perceived shape of your actual feet. Small, arched, and dainty were the gold standard. If you were born with a wide or long foot, you did what you could to disguise it. Some women were said to wrap their toes tightly at night, hoping to mold their feet into a daintier form over time. There's no historical evidence of full-on foot binding, as was practiced in other parts of the world, but the social pressure to have pretty, delicate feet was very real. This leads to the open scholarly debate. How common were these torturous shoes really? Historians still argue whether they were truly everyday wear for most people, or if they were reserved for special occasions and the wealthiest of nobles. After all, if you spend your days working in the fields or a busy workshop, you need to actually be able to walk without impaling a passing chicken. But for the aspiring and the ambitious at court, in the city, or during grand feasts, the pointier the shoe, the better. There's a running theory that a person's worth could almost be measured in the inches of leather trailing from their toes. Let's break for a light joke. Ever try running in poulaines? It's less of a dash and more of an awkward shuffle, with a 50% chance of tripping over your own status symbol. Medieval party games probably included a very slow, very careful race around the manor. The winner gets to keep their dignity, and maybe their shoes. The pressure was no less intense for men, especially young, ambitious ones. A long, pointed shoe was a clear sign that you didn't have to work, run, or do much of anything practical at all. Status was everything, and if it cost you a few blisters, so be it. Of course, the footwear of a noblewoman was often even more complex. To navigate the muddy, filthy streets of a medieval town, ladies would often balance on fragile wooden platforms called pattens, which could raise them several inches above the muck. This came at the price of stability, and it's no wonder that medieval cities often rang with the clatter of wooden soles and the occasional shriek of someone losing their balance and tumbling into the filth. By nightfall, when you finally kick off your shoes and let your feet throb in peace, you marvel at the lengths, literally and figuratively, that people went to in order to fit the medieval ideal. You wonder if anyone really thought it was all worth it. But you know that tomorrow, when it's time for market day or a courtly dance, you'll cram your bruised toes right back into those pointed prisons. Because the world then, as now, is always watching. You stretch your sore toes beneath the covers, thankful for a moment of comfort. But as you lie there in the pre-dawn quiet, your mind drifts to another strange quirk of medieval beauty, one that lives right behind your lips: the teeth. If you thought medieval folks spent their days with pearly whites gleaming in every candlelit hall, you are about to be sorely disappointed. Reality is, a mouthful of perfect teeth wasn't always the dream. In some very specific circles, bad teeth, even ones that hinted at the sweet, Destructive rewards of wealth were actually a sign of status. Here we come to a truly bizarre mainstream historical fact, because sugar was a rare and expensive commodity. Introduced to Europe from the Middle East and available only to the richest nobles and merchants. Blackened or rotting teeth could actually be a subtle sign of affluence. Your sweet tooth, quite literally, became a status symbol. You awaken in a noble's manner, and breakfast is a lavish spread of preserved fruits, honeyed cakes, and perhaps some imported candied ginger. The air is thick with the scent of sugar, precious, expensive, and reserved only for those who could afford a private dentist, which, spoiler alert, hardly existed. To enjoy such treats was a mark of immense privilege. But here's the catch. All that sugar means cavities, aches, and a smile that could frighten the crows from the fields. While a peasant might have teeth worn down from a lifetime of chewing coarse, gritty bread, they were largely spared the rampant decay that came with a high-sugar diet. A nobleman's rotten smile whispered, "I can afford the very thing that is destroying me." This leads to our quirky tidbit for the evening. Some medieval ladies, inspired by the fashionable dental decay of the elite, are rumored to have blackened their teeth on purpose. They would use burnt herbs or powdered charcoal, hoping to fake the sweet life. It's a medieval version of today's designer ripped jeans, except with more throbbing toothaches and far less street cred. While sugar might give you fashionably bad teeth, the rest of society did what they could to keep theirs healthy, or at least intact. Medieval dental hygiene was a patchwork of old wives' tales and wishful thinking. You might chew on a twig to clean your teeth, or rinse with wine or vinegar. If you could afford it, you'd buy special tooth powders made from crushed herbs, salt, or even ground oyster shells. If something really, truly hurt, your only hope was the local barber surgeon. Yes, the same guy who cuts your hair and probably lances your boils might offer to yank the offending tooth with a pair of pliers. There was no anesthetic, of course, just a mug of strong ale for courage, and a prayer that he grabbed the right one. The risk of infection from such a procedure was enormous, and a simple toothache could easily turn into sepsis, a fever that could lead to death. Historians still argue about how bad dental health actually was for the general population. This is a lively, scholarly debate. For a long time, the prevailing view was that, aside from the sugar-addled nobility, most medieval people had surprisingly strong teeth. Thanks to diets low in processed sugar and high in fiber from coarse bread and vegetables. However, more recent archaeological studies of medieval skulls tell a different story. Many skeletons show evidence of severe tooth wear, plaque, painful abscesses, and widespread tooth loss, suggesting that dental misery was a near-constant companion for people of all classes. The gritty, stone-ground flour used in bread acted like sandpaper, wearing down enamel over time and leading to a host of problems. Let's take a moment for a light joke to ease the throbbing. Why did Lady Eleonora always smile with her mouth closed? She didn't want anyone to know she was richer than the king, or that she had a mouthful of holes that whistled in the wind. It wasn't all about status, though. For some, healthy teeth were a must, especially for soldiers, workers, and anyone who relied on all their molars to chew tough bread and dried meat. If you lost too many teeth, you might find eating a serious challenge, leading to malnutrition. And yet, amidst all this decay and pain, there was another contradictory beauty standard. A small gap between the front teeth, sometimes called a witch's window, or more kindly a dents du bonheur, in France was often considered lucky or uniquely alluring. It was thought to be the sign of a good singer, a passionate lover, or a quick-witted flirt. There are poems and love songs from the period dedicated to ladies with charmingly gapped smiles. This just goes to show that medieval beauty was never a single uniform ideal. It was a messy, contradictory collection of trends, where a flaw in one context could be a celebrated feature in another. In the end, you stare at a bowl of candied violets at the feast, and wonder if the momentary sweetness is worth the inevitable pain. For the nobles, the answer was often yes. For everyone else, they chewed their hard bread, hoped for the best, and maybe put a clove of garlic in their cheek to ward off the pain, a folk remedy as dubious as it was common. You're resting your jaw, grateful for the break from sugar-coated status symbols. When your focus drifts upward again, past the vast, plucked expanse of your forehead, eyebrows. You might think the medieval brow was just a bit of furrowed mystery above the eyes, but oh, how wrong you'd be. In the candlelit, smoky halls of the Middle Ages, your eyebrows could make or break your entire look. It's not just about having them, it's about having the right kind. Imagine peering into your polished bronze mirror, the candle guttering beside you, and noticing your brows look, well, normal. That's simply not good enough. For a few wild centuries, the perfect brow is almost invisible. Plucked, shaved, and finessed, until it's little more than a whisper, a ghost of a line, or sometimes vanished altogether. This trend was a natural and extreme extension of the high forehead look we've already endured. The brow had to follow suit, tweezed and scraped into a frail, delicate suggestion hovering high above that porcelain expanse. The higher and more barely there your brows were, the more you fit the courtly ideal. This is a mainstream historical fact. Across much of late medieval Europe, especially in the 15th century, fashion-forward noblewomen plucked their brows with ruthless dedication, a style that was immortalized in paintings of the era. There are endless portraits of queens and ladies-in-waiting whose foreheads seem to stretch on forever, framed only by a faint, almost hesitant brow. This look was so popular that even literature of the time makes sly jokes about girls with brows like clouds, meant to be ethereal and barely there. But not everyone followed these rules, which leads us to a fascinating, quirky tidbit. In some Italian and Spanish regions, and especially in areas with strong Moorish influence, a completely opposite trend held sway. The dramatic, dark, and sometimes singular brow. The unibrow, a feature often mocked in other parts of Europe, was prized in some Mediterranean cultures as a sign of intelligence, power, and sensuality. If your own hair was too fair or patchy, you'd reach for a bit of lampblack, or even burnt almond, and carefully sketch on an arch worthy of a saint, or perhaps a villain. Some women, daring or bored or both, painted their brows in unusual, dramatic shapes. Peaked so high they looked permanently surprised by life itself. This stark regional difference is the subject of an ongoing scholarly debate. Why did the invisible brow trend take hold so fiercely in Northern Europe? Is it simply a matter of following the lead of influential royal courts in France or England? Or was there a deeper symbolism at play? Some art historians argue that the broad, smooth forehead and barely there brows were meant to suggest a kind of angelic innocence or spiritual openness, face unburdened by earthly concerns. Others claim it was just another, more painful way to separate the rich, who could afford the time and tools for endless grooming, from everyone else. Let's be honest, the process was brutal. It wasn't just plucking. Some medieval beauty guides recommended rubbing the skin with a pumice stone to chase the impossible dream of a hair-free brow bone. You might suffer a little redness, a few scabs, but fashion is fashion. Let's take a moment for a joke. Why did Lady Cicely wear a hat indoors? She'd shaved her brows so far back, she forgot where they belonged. The drama of the brow played out in church as well as at court. For highborn girls, the pre-wedding brow ritual could involve hours of grooming, applying strange tinctures, and even whispering a few superstitious charms for a lucky face. One popular ballad went, "A brow too sharp, a tongue too keen, brings trouble to a marriage scene." Yet, if the invisible look wasn't for you, you could always paint on a new pair. Recipes survive for colored powders and homemade eyebrow fillers. The soot from burnt cork, the juice of berries, a smear of animal fat as a binding agent. The results were sometimes dazzling, sometimes disastrous. Your new painted-on brows might run in the rain, smear in the heat, or fade as quickly as your patience. Still, for one shining moment at the feast, you'd have arches like the queens of legend. Historians continue to argue about how much the peasantry cared for such trends. Did they sigh and pluck along with the nobles? Or did they simply laugh at courtly vanities from a safe distance? Some village tales poke gentle fun at the ladies with no brows and nowhere to put them, suggesting a healthy skepticism existed in the wider population. For many, eyebrows were for catching sweat, not for chasing status. But for those caught in the middle, the aspiring merchants, or the daughters of minor lords, the pressure to conform was immense, a constant, nagging reminder that your face was a public statement, whether you liked it or not. You drift a little deeper into the medieval night, the ghost of a brow ache still tingling, only to realize that in this world, caring for your skin is a full-time occupation, a relentless battle against dirt, disease, and the ever-looming demand for perfection. If you thought your modern skincare routine was a bit much, prepare yourself. Medieval beauty treatments make that 10-step serum ritual look like child's play, or maybe just a child's punishment. In a time before antibiotics and actual dermatologists, your skin was both your reputation and your weakness. Every blemish whispered a secret. Too much sun, not enough money, a sleepless night, or even a sinful soul. The fairer, smoother, and more unblemished your skin, the higher your prospects in marriage, status, and even spiritual credit. Meanwhile, one bad rash, a couple of pimples, or a nasty scar could turn you from a courtly beauty into a cautionary tale. The mainstream historical fact is this: medieval women, and plenty of men, used a dizzying array of lotions. Masks, scrubs, and balms, all in the pursuit of luminous skin. Recipe books from the 14th and 15th centuries list concoctions made from almond milk, rosewater, crushed pearls, egg whites, and honey, ingredients that sound surprisingly familiar and are still found in some modern products. But these gentler elements were often joined by a parade of less savory and frankly terrifying additions: lead powder, mercury, vinegar, pig fat, snail slime, and even, in the most desperate cases, animal dung. A medieval spa day, let's be honest, was less about cucumber slices and more about questionable chemistry set experiments. You might start your morning with a splash of cold water straight from the well, water you possibly shared with a passing duck. Then you reach for your whitening paste, a sticky blend of egg white, flour, and vinegar. If you're truly ambitious, or just a glutton for punishment, you'll slather on a brightening mask containing a generous amount of lead or mercury. Never mind that both substances slowly poison you through your skin. There's something almost poetic about risking your health for a glow that could literally kill you. And now for a truly quirky tidbit that takes medieval skincare to the next level. Some of the most exclusive beauty recipes called for crocodile dung, which had to be imported at great expense from the Mediterranean. This was mixed with vinegar and then spread across the skin as a kind of ancient high-status exfoliant. This wasn't as rare as you might hope. Apothecaries and would-be doctors swore by its rejuvenating properties. Next time you complain about an odd-smelling face mask, be glad it doesn't come with scales and a trip down the Nile. Yet not every routine was so dangerous. Almond oil, honey, oatmeal, and rosewater were relatively gentle and remain classic favorites even now. Some women used crushed violets or lilies as a calming toner, and men sometimes splashed themselves with rosemary water for that freshly plucked, vaguely herbal scent. The village healer or local wise woman was your dermatologist, your pharmacist, and your therapist all in one, dishing out advice for every complaint from freckles to boils. But skin was never just skin. Flawless face hinted at virtue, discipline, and God's favor. If you suffered from acne, eczema, or the pockmarks left by smallpox, the stares from your neighbors could be brutal. People widely believed that bad skin signaled bad character or even a divine curse, superstitions that clung to villages and courts alike. This brings us to a major scholarly debate. How much did medieval folk actually understand about cleanliness and disease? For a long time, the popular image was of a perpetually filthy populace that rarely bathed. However, some historical records show surprisingly regular bathing, especially among the wealthy or in places like Hungary and southern Germany, where a strong bath culture persisted. In some towns, public bathhouses thrived for centuries, bustling with gossip, flirtation, and the occasional clandestine business meeting. But these bathhouses were double-edged swords. They were places of cleanliness, but also rumored to be dens of sin. When the Great Plague swept through Europe, authorities grew suspicious, and many bathhouses were shuttered, with the church condemning them, and popular belief holding that opening one's pores in hot water was a surefire way to let the pestilence in. The debate continues. Did closing the bathhouses actually make things worse by making people dirtier and more susceptible to disease? The jury is still out. The great irony is that some of the worst skin problems were a direct result of the very remedies used to fix them. The lead, mercury, and arsenic-based treatments caused peeling, rashes, sores, and eventually irreversible damage to the skin. There are surviving letters from ladies at court lamenting the mysterious rot on their cheeks. It's completely unaware that they were poisoning themselves every single morning. Let's have a small joke here. Why did Lady Agnes never worry about wrinkles? She never lived long enough to get them, thanks to her daily dose of white lead. Another quirky detail to consider is how people dealt with scars. Scars from smallpox, chickenpox, or old injuries were sometimes camouflaged with tiny bits of velvet or silk glued right onto the skin. These beauty patches could be shaped like rounds, stars, or even crescent moons. A courtier might wear a whole constellation of patches, each one signaling a flirtatious mood or serving as a witty rebuke to gossip. Why, yes, I do have a scar, but now it's a fashionable crescent. Thank you very much. In the quiet of the medieval night, you find yourself thankful for your own simple routines, a little soap, a little water, and the hope that tomorrow you'll wake up blemish-free without having to consult a recipe involving a crocodile. You turn in your sleep, the memory of crocodile dung facials blessedly fading. And now you find yourself dreaming of fabrics. The soft whisper of silk, the deep pile of velvet, the rich gleam of gold thread. But beauty in medieval life wasn't just about what you looked like. It was also about what you were allowed to wear. The clothes you put on each morning were a walking advertisement of your worth, your virtue, and of course your ability to follow the ever-shifting rules of fashion. But in a world ruled by sumptuary laws, the original fashion police, looking beautiful, was never simply a matter of taste. It was a dangerous game of status, symbolism, and legal boundaries. This brings us to a crucial mainstream historical fact. Throughout medieval Europe, especially from the 13th century onward, kings, queens, and city councils issued a flood of sumptuary laws. Rules that dictated exactly who could wear what colors, fabrics, and styles. The reason was simple. Clothes had become powerful weapons in the subtle wars of social status. A lowly merchant's wife dressed in imported silk, or a peasant boy sporting a cloak of scarlet red, might be mistaken for nobility. The horror. To the authorities, this was not just a fashion faux pas. It was a threat to the very fabric of society. They responded by micromanaging every hemline, every ribbon, and every dye pot. These laws varied wildly from place to place and year to year. In England, only those of a certain high rank could wear ermine, sable, or scarlet cloth. In Florence, the city council decreed that velvet was strictly for the rich alone, and even then, only in prescribed amounts. If you were caught breaking the rules wearing a forbidden trim, flaunting a prescribed color, or sporting too much lace, you could be fined heavily. Shamed publicly in the town square, or even forced to surrender your beloved illegal garment on the spot. But here's the quirky tidbit. Sumptuary laws often backfired spectacularly. Instead of quelling the fires of fashion competition, they often fueled new waves of creativity and rebellion. Want to wear that forbidden fur? Have it stitched in as a hidden lining that only you and your tailor know about? Can't wear gold embroidery? Stitch your patterns in a vibrant yellow silk? And give a knowing wink to those who understand the code. There are tales of rebellious tailors and crafty housewives who stitch their family's rising status into secret seams, outsmarting the law with every snip of the shears. An even more bizarre detail comes from some Italian cities where there were laws governing underwear. Inspectors, yes. Actual underwear police could be dispatched to weddings or festivals to make sure no one dared to wear forbidden lace or fine linen beneath their rough wool outer garments. Imagine the sheer audacity of it all. This leads to a fascinating scholarly debate that continues today. Did these sumptuary laws actually work? Did they successfully reinforce class distinctions, or did they just give everyone a collective headache? Some historians argue that for the most part, the laws did their job, creating a clear visual language of power that everyone understood. They point to court records filled with fines levied against peasants for a too flashy hood or merchants for an overly luxurious belt. In this view, the laws were an effective tool of social control. However, another school of thought argues that the laws were largely symbolic. It's more about projecting authority than actually changing behavior. These historians suggest that the laws were so frequently ignored or creatively bypassed that they inadvertently spurred on the very fashion innovation they were meant to suppress. This side points to the rise of a black market for forbidden fashion, where smugglers trafficked in rare dyes and silks, so often sneaking them over borders or through city gates hidden in barrels of grain. In this interpretation, the laws didn't stop fashion. they just made it more interesting. As you slip into your daydream, you find yourself standing before a medieval wardrobe. What do you choose? If you're a noble, you reach for a gown of deep blue, dyed with imported indigo, a pigment so precious it's almost worth its weight in gold. If you're less privileged, your color palette is limited to soft browns, muddy greens, and faded yellows. Even the buckle on your belt is scrutinized. Too bright ribbon might mark you as an upstart. A fine linen shift could arouse suspicion. Clothing wasn't just about status either. It was about beauty. Certain shapes were idealized. Long, flowing sleeves, tightly cinched waists, and elaborate hoods and veils. The fit and fall of your dress signaled not only your wealth but also your refinement. Joke break. What's worse than tripping over your own pointed poulaines? Getting stuck in a doorway because your hen in that towering cone-shaped hattie's too tall? Medieval parties had their hazards. The real joke, however, was on the lawmakers. As soon as one fabric or color was banned, a new fad would appear. Wealthy families commissioned tailors to invent ever more elaborate trimmings and cuts, creating a fashion arms race where the lines between beauty, power, and propriety were razor thin. It was a world where a single misplaced gemstone or a too bright velvet cloak could land you in court, defending your very right to look beautiful. You're floating in the warmth of your medieval blanket, imagining for a moment the delicate rustle of velvet and the soft glow of candles catching on gold thread. But as the dream shifts, you find yourself not in the bustling market or a humble peasant field, but at court where beautiful isn't just about how you look or what you wear, but about who sets the standards in the first place. Here, you meet the true trendsetters. Queens, kings, princesses, and dashing lords whose every look ripples out across entire kingdoms, shaping what everyone else aspires to, even if those ideals are as unattainable as a fairy tale castle. This is a central mainstream historical fact of the era, in nearly every kingdom. In duchy across medieval Europe, the royal family, and especially the queen, defined what it meant to be beautiful. Their portraits were copied, their fashions emulated, and their peculiarities, quirks, or even perceived flaws were somehow transformed into the latest craze. The famously high forehead of Isabella of Bavaria, or the delicate, slender figure of Eleanor of Aquitaine, became symbols not just of royal status, but of beauty itself. Poets wrote odes to the snowy skin of Blanche of Castile, while troubadours composed love songs dedicated to the raven hair of Margaret of Anjou. Whether you lived in a muddy village or a stone-walled city, you knew the names, and more importantly, the looks of the era's celebrity royals. But the flip side of this was that royal perfection was almost always out of reach for ordinary folk. The queen had access to imported creams from the East, rare perfumes, professional dressers, and the very best of everything. Her look was achieved with a dedicated team, a bottomless purse, and, quite often, a healthy dose of artistic deception. The portraits that circulated were frequently idealized, with flaws smoothed away and features enhanced by artists who were eager to flatter their powerful patrons. The result was that for most people, beauty became not just impossible, but mythical. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some kings and queens became absolutely obsessed with setting the trend, not just following it. There's the story of Philip the Fair of France, who allegedly ordered all his courtiers to pluck their eyebrows into oblivion and wear shoes with absurdly long points, insisting that his court must shine like the moon among stars. Or consider Isabella of France, who loved the color blue so much that a special Queen S blue dye was developed just for her, and every noble who could afford it clamored to copy her exact shade. When Queen Elizabeth of Hungary popularized rosemary water as a skin tonic, suddenly every noblewoman in Europe wanted a bottle. The wealthy hired apothecaries to create elaborate imitations, soaked rosemary in rainwater, and simply hoped for the best. This brings us to another open scholarly debate. Did these powerful royal standards truly trickle down to the masses, or were they confined to the gilded cage of the upper crust? Some historians argue that even the lowest-born peasants aspired to echo the king's or queen's latest look, even if only in the humblest of ways. Certain color of wool, a new twist in the hair, a bit of fabric pinned just so. They point to the fact that peasants and merchants, who could never hope to attend court, still saw the queen's face on coins, in church-stained glass, or carved into prayer books. Others, however, contend that for most people, The world of courtly beauty was a distant spectacle, little more than idle gossip and daydreams. They argue that rural life had its own practical standards, and that peasants likely found the extreme fashions of the court to be ridiculous. For men, the stakes were equally high. If the king sported a carefully trimmed beard or a certain style of hat, every noble in the land followed suit. The French and Burgundian courts quarreled endlessly over the correct way to tie a doublet, or how high one should perch a feather in one's cap. When King Edward IV of England's height and golden hair became the masculine ideal, shorter, darker-haired men had to work twice as hard to make a splash at court. But sometimes it wasn't a perfect feature that became the trend, but a royal defect. This is another quirky detail of the era. When Anne of Brittany was painted with slightly protruding ears, suddenly, portraits across France began to feature young women with similar ears, sometimes even exaggerated for artistic effect. When Henry VIII's later portraits depicted him as broad-shouldered and ruddy, the English court embraced a beefier ideal, praising good color and robust appetites. Even scars could become fashionable if worn by the right royal. Beauty for the royal family was always a performance, a message. Queens would commission tapestries showing themselves as saints or biblical heroines, using their image to promote piety, wisdom, or charity. A soft, calm expression could suggest compassion, while a firm jaw implied resolve and the strength to rule. In the end, you wander through the palace of your dreams, watching the flicker of torchlight on jewel-bright fabrics and listening to the soft whisper of silk. Tomorrow, you'll wake up to your own reflection, maybe a little less royal, but just as real. You stir, imagining the dazzling court receding into the distance, its glamour lingering like the trace of a perfume. But medieval beauty was never just a matter of smooth skin, polished shoes, or royal fashions. It often came down to the quirks and oddities of the body itself, the stories people told, the charms they whispered, and the superstitions they harbored, all of which gave rise to a wild and wonderful catalog of physical features considered beautiful, lucky, or sometimes deeply suspect. Tonight, you find yourself squinting at your own reflection in a polished bit of metal, wondering, would your traits have been a blessing or a curse in the Middle Ages? Are you the lucky owner of a dimpled chin or a single dramatic eyebrow? In this world, the line between beauty and peculiarity is as thin as a single lock of hair. Let us begin with a mainstream historical fact that might seem charming to our modern eyes. Medieval sources, from folk songs to courtly poems, are brimming with positive comments on certain physical quirks. Some features were almost universally admired. Dimples, for instance, whether in the cheeks or chin, were linked to luck, a cheerful spirit, and laughter. A well-shaped nose, neither too sharp nor too flat, could hint at noble lineage. Tales abounded of lovers swooning for a perfectly cleft chin or a mysterious beauty spot. These weren't seen as imperfections. They were marks of divine favor or a happy fate. In some parts of France and England, hopeful parents would even gently press a newborn's cheeks with their fingertips, hoping to encourage dimples to form and thereby bring their child lifelong luck. For a boy, a strong cleft chin or a single dimple was often seen as a mark of courage or a sign of future greatness. But for every celebrated feature, there was one that drew suspicion, which brings us to our quirky tidbit. Moles, freckles, and birthmarks occupied a very strange and dangerous space in the medieval imagination. In some eras, a well-placed mola beauty spot on the cheek, or just above the lip, was becoming the inspiration for the delicate silk or velvet patches that courtiers would use to accentuate their faces. But too many spots, or a single mark in an unlucky place, could spark rumors of witchcraft or devil's bargains. Superstition hung heavy over the body. A mole on your left shoulder was said to bring misfortune, while one on your right cheek might make you irresistible. There are even records of wise women being paid to read moles and freckles, promising to reveal glimpses into your future or your past based on the random patterns on your skin. The infamous witch hunts of the late medieval and early modern periods relied heavily on hunting for such physical signs, a devil S mark or a witch ST. More than one poor soul probably spent a lifetime hiding a simple birthmark, just in case the wrong person saw it on the wrong day. This leads to a fascinating open scholarly debate. Just how much did these folk beliefs actually affect the everyday lives of ordinary people? Did a superstition about a birthmark truly have the power to change a person's destiny? Some historians, pointing to court records and witch trial documents, argue that yes, these beliefs could be life-altering, leading to ostracism or even death. Others, however, argue that for most people, these were just stories. They contend that the majority of people simply lived with the bodies they had, relying on a clever story, a fashionable patch, or a local charm to turn a potential curse into a celebrated blessing. The truth, as always, likely lies somewhere in between. The list of prized quirks was long and varied. A small gap between the front teeth was called a lucky tooth, or dents du bon air in parts of France, and was associated with good singing and a quick wit. Let us have a joke. Why did Lady Cicely draw a tiny heart on her cheek before the feast? Because Sir Geoffrey said he'd only dance with a woman marked by love, and she wasn't leaving anything to chance. In some Slavic countries, a woman with naturally red hair was both admired for her striking beauty and feared for her supposed connection to magic. In Northern Europe, it might be mocked, but across Southern Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean, a single bold line of hair above the eyes was celebrated as a sign of intelligence, power, and sensuality. Mothers would paint an extra darkness on their daughters' brows. Now poets would praise the single noble arch above twin stars. Folklore became a kind of survival guide, teaching you what to show, what to hide, and how to turn a physical liability into a social asset. And so, as you nestle deeper under your covers, you marvel at the medieval tapestry of oddities and charms. Every crooked smile, every freckle, every dimple was part of the game. A reminder that beauty, even then, was never truly uniform or predictable. You settle deeper beneath your blanket, imagining a world thick with candles, prayers, and if we're being honest, some very questionable smells. Because in medieval times, beauty wasn't just what you saw, it was what you sensed. The nose, as much as the eyes, ruled the game of social standing. Tonight, you're drifting through perfumed courts and smoky village huts, unraveling the strange story of scents, bathing taboos, and the curious art of smelling beautiful in a world that was often anything but. Let's begin with the mainstream historical fact. The medieval world was far more fragrant, sometimes far more pungent than we might imagine. Aromatic herbs and perfumes were everywhere, at least in the upper echelons of society. The wealthy had access to a dazzling array of imported spices and rare oils. Rose water from Persia, ambergris from the sea, musk from the farthest east, and even tiny, precious vials of attar of roses, guarded like treasure. A drop or two, dabbed on a wrist or behind the ears, could signify immense sophistication and wealth, setting you apart in any crowded hall. Yet, for most people, true cleanliness was elusive. Regular bathing, especially full immersion baths, was often discouraged. Particularly in the chilly north, out of a genuine fear that it would open the body's pores and let evil humors, or even the plague itself, seep into the body. While public bathhouses did flourish in some cities for centuries, as acting as places of pleasure, business, and social intrigue, they eventually fell under suspicion during epidemics, and were often condemned by religious authorities as dens of vice. At home, drawing and heating enough water for a full bath was a luxury few could afford or be bothered with. Most people managed with a quick, daily scrub of their hands, face, and feet, followed by a generous dusting of herbs or a spritz of rose water, if they were lucky enough to have it. This leads us to a truly quirky tidbit of medieval hygiene. Because water was believed to carry disease, many in the upper classes practiced a form of dry bathing. This involved vigorously rubbing the body with clean, dry linen cloths, sometimes soaked in herbal infusions to remove dirt and sweat. This would be followed by a dusting of aromatic powders made from things like lavender, rosemary, sage, or sweet marjoram. These rituals would leave the skin perfumed and feeling soft, but they did very little to fight actual bacteria. The result was a strange paradox. The cleanest people at court were sometimes in a microbial sense less clean than their peasant counterparts who at least had the good sense to bathe in a cold river when the weather allowed. This brings us to a constant scholarly debate. Just how stinky were the Middle Ages really? Some records and satirical poems insist that the wealthy were surprisingly fastidious. washing and changing their clothes far more often than we assume. But other accounts paint a picture of a world of overwhelming odor, human, animal, culinary, and chemicals. In chemically crowded towns where chamber pots were emptied directly onto the streets. The truth is likely a mix of both. There were bursts of heady perfume in the palace, the honest scent of sweat in the field, and everywhere, the inescapable temps of wood smoke, wet wool, and a life lived in close proximity to the land. Some anthropologists argue that the medieval nose was simply less sensitive, or at least less bothered by odors we would find appalling today. However, other historians counter this, pointing to the extensive records of perfume recipes and the booming trade in scented goods as proof of a universal human desire to mask, modify, and control the world through fragrance. For women of status, fragrance was a form of armor. A well-scented lady could float through a hall, her presence marked by whispers of "Did you smell Lady Blanche's new jasmine water?" Scented gloves, pomander which were little ornate balls of perfume, often worn on a belt or held in the hand, and even sweet-smelling jewelry were all the rage. A pomander in particular was believed to ward off illness, especially the dreaded plague. Tucked up a sleeve or pressed to the nose in a crowded street, it was both a fashion statement and a desperate protective measure. Men, too, engaged in the art of scent. Knights and courtiers were expected to appear both powerful and pleasant. A bad-smelling man might be accused of laziness, drunkenness, or worst of all, poor breeding. Some noblemen carried scented handkerchiefs or wore sachets of herbs tucked inside their doublets. It was said that Richard the Lionheart could be tracked across his campsites by the faint trail of rosewater he left behind. A legend, perhaps, but a legend with its own kind of fragrant truth. As you drift off, you can almost smell the strange mix of it all, the cool, damp tang of castle stone, the sweet ghost of a lavender sachet, and the distant, smoky scent of a village hearth. A world where beauty was not only seen, but smelled. The medieval night grows darker, and with every breath you take, the scents of lavender and wood smoke linger, mingling with the imagined echoes of candlelit laughter. But in this flickering half-light, the desire to change the face, to add color, erase flaws, and conjure a different self grows, as relentless as ever. Tonight you tumble headlong into the strange, risky world of medieval cosmetics. Powders, rouges, and secret recipes where the line between beauty and danger is as thin as a dusting of lead. The mainstream historical fact is that by the late Middle Ages, cosmetics were not just for queens and courtesans. Women, and occasionally men, across the upper echelons of European society, experimented with a wide range of homemade and purchased concoctions to perfect their faces. Pale skin, as we know, remained the absolute standard, so whitening powders were in constant demand. Women would crush white lead, chalk, or even ground bone into a fine dust, mixing it with vinegar or rose water to create a thick, sticky paste. The result was a porcelain mask that might look divine by candlelight, but which slowly poisoned the wearer day by day. That's the first uncomfortable truth. The most effective cosmetics were, by modern standards, highly toxic. Lead, mercury, and arsenic appeared in beauty recipes everywhere. Blended with egg white for a smoother finish, with vinegar to strip away oils, or with honey to help the mixture set. Early physicians and moralists warned of the consequences: rashes, trembling hands, and skin that seemed to melt away, but the pressure for otherworldly beauty was relentless. You might have known deep down that your morning routine was dangerous, but the lure of achieving that flawless, saintly skin was incredibly hard to resist. This brings us to a series of quirky tidbits about the ingredients themselves. Medieval makeup wasn't just about the skin. Some fashionistas would mix soot or lamp black with a bit of animal fat to darken their eyelashes and brows, creating an early form of mascara that was applied with small sticks or tiny, delicate brushes. For a healthy flush on the cheeks and lips, red ochre or ground cochineal beetles provided a vibrant pigment, while a dab of honey helped the rouge stay in place. There's even evidence of women simply rubbing a cut beet or a handful of mulberries onto their cheeks for a natural blush, hoping the effect would last through a long feast or a courtly dance. For lips, red was all the rage. Recipes survive for crimson salves made from madder root, alkanet, or even in the most daring formulas. A bit of sheep's blood thickened with wax or tallow. The bolder, the color, the more of a statement you made. However, in a society so heavily influenced by the church, the use of makeup existed in a state of constant tension. This has fueled a long-standing scholarly debate. Was makeup a symbol of female liberation or a tool of submission? Is it a form of rebellion or an act of conformity? Some historians argue that cosmetics offered women a rare measure of control and agency over their appearance, a way to craft their own identity in a world that sought to define them. From this perspective, painting one's face was an act of personal artistry. Others, however, contend that makeup was just another impossible standard. It's a way of forcing women to conform to patriarchal ideals of beauty, often at great risk to their own health. The truth is likely a complex mixture of both. A woman might paint her face in secret, scrubbing off every trace before her husband returned home. Her beauty routine, a private act of self-care. Another might use it as a weapon, outshining her rivals at court with a perfectly applied paste. But the process was always risky. Let's have a little joke. Why did Lady Joan stop wearing her favorite rouge? Because every time it rained, she left faint red streaks down her cheeks and a trail of very confused suitors in her wake. Beyond the slow, creeping dangers of lead and mercury, there was always the threat of social exposure. Priests and preachers railed against vanity from the pulpit. Jealous rivals might whisper that your beauty was a lie, a trick of the light. The line between art and deceit was always blurred, yet there were even subtler tricks in the medieval cosmetic bag. To create the illusion of higher cheekbones, some women would apply a faint shadow of gray or blue powder, just under the eyes or along the jawline. Centuries before contouring would become a modern craze. If you wanted a sparkle in your eye, a dab of egg white on the eyelids promised a glossy shine, while a sprinkle of ground pearls could make the skin gleam like the moon. So you lie there, eyes closed, picturing a world of flickering mirrors and secret jars, where every face was both mask and message. In the medieval night, the wish for beauty was both a hope and a hazard, a powder-dusted tightrope walk between admiration and danger, innovation and disaster. You turn in your sleep, carried onward by the soft echoes of church bells and the afterglow of candlelit prayers. But tonight, you slip into a world where faith and appearance are so closely intertwined that even your reflection seems to whisper, "Are you pious enough to be pretty?" Welcome to the shadowy crossroads of holiness, guilt, and the impossible standards of beauty set not by artists or royals, but by priests, preachers, and saints. This brings us to a complex, mainstream historical fact. Throughout the Middle Ages, the Christian Church, particularly the Catholic Church, profoundly influenced all attitudes toward the body, and physical beauty was a dangerous, double-edged sword. On one hand, it was sometimes seen as a reflection of God's divine grace, proof that the soul within was well-ordered and favored by heaven. Medieval sermons and religious treatises are often littered with the language of radiance, purity, and the beauty of holiness. On the other hand, the Church relentlessly taught that pride in one's looks was a perilous temptation, a direct path to the deadly sin of vanity. You awaken in this world of contradiction. In church, the illuminated saints on the walls and in the stained glass windows glow with perfect pale faces, unblemished and serene, while outside, the local priest thunders from the pulpit against the painted cheeks and plucked brows of the fashionable women in his congregation. The result is an endless, exhausting push and pull. You must strive for a kind of beauty, then apologize for achieving it, then strive all over again. In art and hagiography, the lives of saints, the holy, are often depicted as ethereally beautiful. Skin as white as ivory, hair like spun gold, and expressions as placid as still water. The Virgin Mary, above all, sets the ultimate ideal, a face as calm as moonlight, a body untainted by labor or sin. Paintings, frescoes, and sculptures all reinforce this message. Holy equals spotless, gentle, and eternally young. For women especially, the pressure is relentless. Your body is not truly your own. It is a vessel to be presented to God, to be judged for its purity as much as for its beauty. And this is where we find a truly quirky and often grim tidbit. The legends of female saints are full of women who are famed for their beauty, yet who shunned it as a diabolical snare. To escape the unwanted attention of powerful men or to prove their devotion to God, some saints were said to have engaged in acts of self-imposed uglying. St. Agnes and St. Cecilia are described as radiant, but they veiled their faces, cut their hair, reject all worldly adornment. Some legends tell of holy women who rubbed their faces with ashes, wore coarse itching hair shirts under their fine gowns, or even deliberately wounded themselves to escape a forced marriage or the lustful gaze of suitors. Holiness, in these dramatic tales, becomes the ultimate disguise. Their goal was not simply to avoid sin, but to claim a different, higher kind of beauty, the radiance of suffering, the mark of martyrdom. This intense focus on the body and its appearance has fueled a long and open scholarly debate. Did the Church's teachings about beauty ultimately empower or imprison women? Some scholars argue that the condemnation of vanity and physical allure was a way to keep the social order intact, a method of controlling women by channeling their energy away from self-expression and toward piety, humility, and domestic service. In this view, the Church reinforced a patriarchal system where a woman's body was a source of temptation that had to be controlled. However, other historians argue that the Church, perhaps unintentionally, also offered an alternative path to power and respect. By emphasizing spiritual beauty over physical beauty, it created a space for women who did not or could not conform to secular standards. The wise old widow, the plain-faced but pious nun, or the scarred healer, could all achieve a kind of beauty and status through their faith. That is denied to them in the secular world. But the Church's relationship with beauty was never straightforward. Many sermons warned that too much concern for one's looks could invite demonic temptation. A mirror, especially when gazed into on a Sunday, was often called the devil's looking glass. Let's have a little joke. Why did Brother Martin hide the monastery's only mirror? To stop the novices from checking for halos instead of praying. For ordinary women, these conflicting messages offered both comfort and confusion. Was it right to care about your looks, or was it a trap for your soul? Could you braid your hair with a colorful ribbon for the festival, or did you risk damning yourself by delighting in such a worldly style? The answers were never clear, and in the silence of the medieval night, you can almost feel the weight of that uncertainty. A burden carried by countless women as they navigated the impossible demands of faith and fashion. You turn in your sleep, carried onward by the soft echoes of church bells and the afterglow of candlelit prayers.
Ow.
But tonight's journey isn't finished. Not until you've wandered the wildest, most enchanted places where medieval beauty took root, the world of legends, myths, and fairy tales. For every law and sermon, there was a story spun by the firelight, whispered in secret, and etched into the illuminated margins of ancient book stories about faces and bodies so impossibly perfect, they could never quite exist in the waking world. This brings us to our final mainstream historical fact. Medieval Europe was a world shaped by stories as much as by sermons or royal proclamations. The beautiful in these tales were the princesses, knights, fae, and saints who set ideals so dazzling and remote that real mortals could only dream, envy, or despair. In romance poems, fairy tales, and miracle legends, beauty wasn't just difficult to achieve. It was supernatural, often dangerous, and sometimes even a curse. Imagine you're a child again, huddled beside your grandmother's knee as she recites the tale of a maiden whose hair spilled down the castle steps like golden water, or a knight whose face shone so bright it blinded the wicked. These images live not just in words, but in tapestries, stained glass, and carved church screens. Storybook beauty standards filtered into daily life, creeping into wedding rituals, carnival games, and even the secret hopes and fears of parents gazing at their newborns. Take the ever-popular legend of the Swan Maiden, or the story of Snow White. Her skin whiter than snow, her lips red as blood, and her hair as dark as a raven's wing. This fairy tale formula became a cultural template. Skin like ivory, eyes like stars, lips like rose petals. These phrases were repeated so often that even peasants who had never seen a real princess dreamed of those impossible traits. And so, girls and women were measured not just against their neighbors or their queens, but against the unreachable heroines of every story. This is where we find a quirky tidbit. Some of the wildest beauty standards came straight from the realm of the supernatural. In parts of France and Germany, it was said that only a girl with a moon-shaped face could see fairies in the woods at dusk, while a boy with mirror-clear eyes could catch a glimpse of the devil. What did the poor soul born with a smattering of freckles or a set of crooked teeth? Legends often blamed these features on fairy mischief, a changeling's curse, or a sign that a mother had offended a local spirit. For men, the standards were equally enchanted. The great epic poems prized knights with sun-bright hair, marble limbs, and the strength of 3 oxen. One famous tale described a hero whose golden beard was so dazzling it frightened horses and mesmerized maidens. But there was always a twist. In these stories, great beauty might attract the love of a queen, but it could also attract the envy of a rival sorcerer. In the Arthurian cycle, Sir Lancelot's perfect face and form become both his greatest blessing and the very root of his tragic downfall. This brings us to a fascinating, open scholarly debate. Did these fairy tale standards make life harder for ordinary people, or did they offer a form of escape? A world of wishful thinking where anyone with enough luck or a touch of magic might be transformed. Some historians argue that these stories only deepened anxiety about one's looks, setting a bar so high it was designed to make everyone feel inadequate. Others, however, suggest that the stories provided a kind of psychological comfort. An alternate universe where ugliness was often redeemed, curses were broken, and the kind-hearted outcast was ultimately rewarded. Think of Beauty and the Beast, Cinderella, or the tale of the Loathly Lady stories, where a spell or a simple act of mercy reveals true loveliness beneath a flawed surface. For the person whose nose was too big, whose hair was too wild, or whose skin was too scarred, these tales might sting, but they could also offer a glimmer of hope. These stories also directly shaped real-world rituals. At medieval weddings, brides often wore garlands of flowers, a practice meant to invoke the fairy blessings from their favorite tales. Children's hair was brushed until it was said to shine like the sun, and some mothers rubbed their infants with butter, hoping to give them the smooth, pale skin of the elves. Let's have a joke. Why did the knight refuse to rescue the princess? She's too perfect, he sighed. I'll never keep up with the laundry. The church sometimes fought back against these pagan ideals, but often with mixed results. The lives of saints became a kind of fairy tale in their own right. The beautiful virgin who resists temptation, the handsome martyr whose wounds only make him more radiant. Miracles, not makeup, could transform the body, yet even these holy stories set impossible examples. And so, as you drift toward morning, fairy tales swirl in the darkness, shimmer of golden hair, a flash of silver eyes, a kiss that turns a frog into a prince. You understand at last that the greatest power of these impossible standards was not in their cruelty, but in their promise. If only, they whispered, you could be beautiful, everything would change. And the world never stopped believing that promise, even if beauty itself was as slippery as a story and as fleeting as a dream. And so, the night deepens, and the stories begin to fade. You've wandered through castles and cathedrals, trudged muddy village roads, and stared into the polished mirrors of lords and saints alike. You felt the sting of the plucking tweezers, the pinch of pointed shoes, the suffocating embrace of a tightly laced gown. You've smelled the strange perfumes of the court and the honest scent of the fields. And you've seen how beauty, in all its brutal and bizarre forms, was a constant, relentless pursuit. But now it's time to let those images soften. Let the flickering candles of the great hall dissolve into a warm, gentle glow. Let the stone walls of the castle melt away, leaving only the quiet comfort of your own room. The echoes of old church bells and whispered fairy tales grow faint, replaced by the soft, steady rhythm of your own breathing. The impossible standards, the dangerous potions, the endless striving. You can let it all go now. You are here, safe in your own time, in your own skin. There is no need to be paler or taller, or to reshape yourself to fit a world that has long since turned to dust. The journey is over. The only thing left to do is rest. Let your mind grow quiet, your body grow heavy, and allow the gentle tide of sleep to carry you away. Far from the judgment of the past, into the simple, peaceful beauty of the present moment. Close your eyes. You are enough. Sleep well.